In this entry, we'll be taking a look at Ego, the living planet from Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. A self-absorbed and malevolent individual, the aptly named Ego was an entity whose haughty perception of himself led to his sole conquest of the annihilation of all life in the universe. As a celestial, Ego came to existence millions of years ago, recounting the moment when he was adrift in the cosmos, consumed by the one emotion of loneliness. Over time, Ego built himself into the planet that we see in the film, which he describes as about the size of Earth's moon. As with all intelligent beings, on top of the loneliness that he experienced, Ego was plagued by a lack of purpose and sought meaning in life. This meaning began with the search for other life forms in the universe, an experience he described as disappointing when he did find them. This disappointment has its root in Ego's immortality with its resulting pride, and he himself says as much when he tells Peter that everything is temporary, we are forever. After witnessing the frailty and mortality of other life forms, Ego came to the point where he saw beauty only in himself, realizing that his desire to seek out other life forms was not so that he could walk among them, but so that he could consume all that exists in the universe until he sees himself in everything, an endeavor which he affectionately dubs the expansion. But one obstacle stands in the way of achieving that goal, his limitation in being a single celestial. Requiring a peer for the expansion, Ego sought to replicate his genes in an offspring, coupling himself with various life forms across the galaxies. To achieve this process of coupling, Ego would represent himself in a humanoid form. In his planetary state, Ego appears as a lush tropical paradise abundantly covered in pristine plant life and flowing with crystal clear water. In his humanoid form, Ego can alter his appearance to become anything he wishes, and I'd imagine that he would have transformed himself to resemble other aliens in his coupling efforts. But the appearance we see most often in the film is that of the deceptively crafted image he puts forth to Peter, the father he never had, an elderly bearded man with graying hair, compassionate eyes, and a charismatic smile. And while he may claim to have the full anatomy of a human, we see that Ego is not subject to the same constraints of the human body. His humanoid form doesn't require breathing air, which we can infer by his ability to wander about in space without a suit. Also, in the campfire scene, while he may claim to need to take a whiz, it's unlikely that he would need to perform excretory functions in his body. That was probably an excuse put forth to leave the scene after the awkward profession of his so-called love for Peter, which didn't do much to convince him. One physical need, however, that Ego shares with other life forms is his need for sleep, something which requires the help of Mantis. Which begs the question as to what would cause Ego to suffer his insomnia. It's unlikely that it arose out of guilt from the deaths of his offspring, despite the number of which possibly amounted to millions or even trillions of victims, given that Ego might have been reproducing with other life forms for several millennia. Whenever he mentions his offspring, he speaks of them casually and with little regard, writing them off as mistakes and expressing his dismay that they didn't carry his genes. By default, he already finds other life forms to be disappointing on a general level to begin with, regarding them as subspecies inferior to him. This perception of inferiority leads to one horrific outcome, his lack of respect for other life forms, and therefore he has no remorse with his goal of consuming possibly quadrillions of lives in his expansion across the universe. So it stands to reason that the cause of Ego's insomnia lies somewhere else. If anything, it most likely stems from his inability to fulfill his self-appointed goal of expansion. For someone in his position, he has been waiting for what could be thousands or millions of years for a suitable offspring. All that amount of waiting in vain is likely to bring along with it feelings of frustration, hopelessness, and a sense of resignation, all of which keep him awake at night, wondering if he would ever attain meaning in life. In hindsight, when re-watching this film in light of his true intentions, it gives another level of depth to the way that Ego looks at Peter with keen interest, only valuing him for the contribution he brings to his goal. After finally managing to get through to his son about his love for Meredith, Ego somewhat exposes his true intent with his over-enthusiastic response over Peter's newfound powers. Given that Ego spends much of the film dealing in deception, it's up to us to determine which portions of his speech are lies and which are the truth. What might immediately appear to be the biggest of his lies is the love he professes for Peter's mother, Meredith, especially given the fact that he was responsible for her demise. But it's possible that for a time, however brief, that Ego did have some genuine feelings for Meredith, although it was a relationship that wasn't meant to be. At this point of the film, Ego has no further need to lie to Peter. He believes that he has fully won his son over and is free to be truthfully candid with him. Hence, the emotional dilemma he felt over the death of Meredith is likely to be genuine. Given his affinity for her, one might think that he might as well accompany her for the next 60 to 70 years of her remaining life on Earth. After all, 70 years is a drop in the bucket compared to the millions of years he's already been waiting for. But of his own admission, Ego's life force is tied to his status as a planet, mentioning that his bodily form will wither and die if he doesn't return to it regularly. Given that he doesn't breathe air, it's likely that this is true, that his actual sustenance comes from the planet, and therefore staying on Earth to be with Meredith is not viable for him. So his affection for Meredith would come at a price, in the form of the temptation to stay behind on Earth, which would threaten his existence. It comes down to his survival or hers, and I'd imagine, given that he feels he is the superior being and one with a greater mission, he must have felt that no relationship would be worth the cost of jeopardizing his purpose, especially one that was fated to be temporal. To quote Ego in his attempt to win back Peter, he poses the question, what greater meaning can life possibly have to offer? Eventually, his priority shifted back to the expansion, and while Ego formally compared his relationship with Meredith to the love that a sailor has for the sea, a reference to the song Brandy by Looking Glass, he effectively tells Peter that his goal of the expansion is his true love as he crushes his son's Walkman. Perhaps this was always meant to be, as the other affectionate name that Ego had for Meredith was the term river lily. And that itself could have been a reference to the plant that he left rooted in the soil, a sign that his ultimate love was for his own sense of purpose. At the end, Ego and Peter, being father and son, become a foil to each other, with Ego being unable to comprehend that Peter would knowingly reject the state of immortality, the very trait that Ego has been priding himself over. When it comes down to it, it would be hard to find anything redeemable about Ego's motives. They are purely selfish and serve no one but himself, a reflection of the notion that beauty is only found in being imperishable. In contrast, to borrow a quote from the words of Vision, a thing isn't beautiful because it lasts. Perhaps he could be a more sympathetic villain if he had no choice, if somehow the expansion of the universe was necessary for his survival. But it appears to be a non-essential function for him and simply out of his own conjured sense of purpose. And if Ego's purpose for living is only to cause the death of all life, and if he cannot live without purpose, then that only leaves him as an incompatible being with no place in the universe.